Farming is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, and a lot of folks in the ag community too are helping in their local communities to ensure safety throughout their whole group, whether it's at their church or whether it's with friends and family or in the community itself.
So this is the only part of the podcast that you listen to. On behalf of Bayer and Climate FieldView, please be safe during your harvest season in 2024.
So Luke, we have you today with us, and we're excited to have one of our experts. Again, my name's Tom Versman, and excited to be here with you.
I'm Andy Folta.
Andy,
always happy to join.
Always happy to be with you too. But Luke, we both have gotten the privilege to work with you outside of what you do with FieldView, and you are really involved in your community. So why don't you kind of give us the backstory, maybe how you got there, and a little bit about what you're doing with climate too.
So currently today, I work as a product manager in our data acquisition group, so commonly known as the FieldView Drive, FieldView Cab app. As growers are, collecting data in field, that's kind of the area that I work day to day.
Yep.
And I live in Southern Illinois, and we have a lot of tractor dealerships, a lot of farms, very, rural. And so, working at that dealership and, being a former FieldView dealer and working through support is kind of how I got here today. But all roads back to the beginning, whenever I was out in the field, I saw a need in the local community to be involved with the fire department. There's a statistic actually that 70% of all fire departments in the U.S. are made up of volunteers. So a lot of our, customers were also firefighters. That's kind of how I got, into the fire service. So I've been in the fire service for probably about 8 years.
8 years, okay.
Wow.
How's that been? Is that something that you've really enjoyed, and you'd say you'd recommend it to anybody?
Yeah, I mean, you look at a lot of this stuff, it's very dangerous and something I never thought I'd kind of get into. But when you look at the farming industry, really, you look at industrial complexes that have like hazardous materials and a lot of like heavy machinery, you kind of have, a lot of resources. But you look externally, we don't have a whole lot of resources, like access to things like water, resources of people, physical labor, right? So it's been the community aspect of it, right? Like getting to know people in the community. Like on our department, we have 30 volunteers, but some people drive into the city for work. They're not around during the day. So it's very natural. Like there's been a few times where I've been out on a farm with a customer and we get a fire call. We just get in the same truck and go, take care of business.
Yeah. So 30 people on the fire department. How many people are in the hometown?
Our village, we cover 800 residents.
So that's a pretty high percentage. And you kind of talked about it, Tom, but you said there's a really neat intersection of the people that were your customers were also your coworkers on the fire department. Farming is one of the most dangerous jobs out there, but also being a first responder in that community kind of doubles down on that commitment.
Yep. And you look at it from like the public perception too. You look at, what that means is the people that are providing, food, fuel, and fiber for our industry is also protecting our assets and protecting our lives. There's I always joke that if we're not in the tractor halting traffic, we're halting traffic because of a wreck or, something on there. So as much as there are times that it's inconvenient to maybe the public for, roadway safety and things like that, it's oftentimes the same people in the tractor that are also behind the wheel of a fire truck.
We think about fall harvest being one of the busiest times. People are going to football games, but also farm equipment is moving, across the countryside. What are some of the things that you look at and see as both someone in the ag industry, but also a first responder as things that you can do, best practices?
Yeah, I think maintaining your equipment is going to be the biggest thing, especially for like fire prevention, fire safety. You look at all the moving parts on a combine. That's the number one cause of a fire, right, in the field, and especially in harvest. Here in Southern Illinois, parts of Missouri, we haven't had rain here in weeks, right? So there's a high risk of that. And then you look at the road safety piece. You're going to have a lot of grain dust, so making sure your markers, if you have LED lights and any type of visibility you can, that's really important. You look at some of the advances in technology, right? You have we have HD cameras that you can have 360 degrees of view and wireless cameras. You look at lines of cars behind you for, a quarter mile or whatever, before you have these massive implements that with the ability of wireless cameras, you can kind of move those around pretty effortlessly. It also kind of plays into like making sure that the people on your operation kind of know your role and kind of where you're going, planning that out throughout the day.
Let's think about other folks even passing through town, right? How and what should you be thinking about when you're maybe going past a combine right now, especially with harvest kicking off and folks and big equipment being on the road at the same time?
Yeah, the biggest thing for, motorists is, don't get rubberneck syndrome. Rubbernecking is kind of the number one cause of accidents because there's an accident or something that you're looking at and you're not really paying attention to the road. So if you're driving, make sure your eyes are on the road and you're kind of not looking around for these other things. Myself, I'm very guilty of when I'm driving, especially during fungicide season. You see these airplanes flying across the road, spraying crops, right? It's super cool to watch, but that's a very real danger.
Paying attention, yeah.
So, just if you're driving, making sure you're focused on the road and things like that.
No, that's
especially
good.
If there is already an accident too. I know I'm guilty of it every time I drive by. Either someone's got pulled over or if there's an accident, I get rubberneck syndrome pretty bad trying to check out and ascertain what might have happened.
I've never heard it called rubberneck syndrome, I guess. Maybe that's just me. Road rage, I guess, is what I'm familiar with. But
I would imagine that you have road rage. But I think I wonder if Bayer might have a product for rubberneck syndrome. I don't know.
A Bayer approved product.
A Bayer approved product. But staying on technology, so I know farm sizes are getting bigger. And, I know that one of my younger cousins started working for a larger operation. And they had 10, 15 people that were in that farm operation for harvest. They hire a bunch of people on, kind of midway through the season and get them trained up. How is technology, or how could you see technology kind of help, people in their planning and their preparation as we get into a busy time of year like harvest?
Yeah, for sure. I think technology plays a big role in understanding where are people at, when are things coming. Even simple things of understanding, is lunch on the way? You look at when you're in the heat of the battle, you may forget to eat lunch, you may forget to drink, that is important for you to stay hydrated, stay nourished as you're going through because they're long, strenuous days, right? So, you look at the technology and the ability for you to communicate without having to call or be on the phone. Simple things like hands-free devices, a lot of newer cabs even have, Apple CarPlay in the machine itself. And you look at tools like FieldView, right? Like you can see where somebody is in real time and get directions there, right? So, you look at technology and the ability that it plays in that, and even simple things like reminders, right? And I know like on my Apple Watch, it tells me when I need to stand up or, things like that. There's a lot to that, both for your physical and mental health, which is really important.
It is. And Luke, you said you've been doing this for eight years, right? So 8 years. What has been in those 8 years the biggest advancement for you from a technology perspective?
I would say the biggest advancement has been our ability as first responders. A lot of our tools have become wireless. So you look at, we were talking about the big machinery, it takes a lot of hydraulic power. Historically, that meant that we would be lifting heavy machines with hydraulic rams, and a lot of that stuff historically was like through gas motors and really big and clunky. So the advancements of like our extrication tools, the advancements we have, and just a lot of the abilities of like rescue in that regard. So you look at terms of traffic incidents or, a lot of farming accidents or, either tractor rollovers or, a car runs into a tractor, that's not a typical type of scenario that you're going to have when it's like a normal vehicle to vehicle, because tractors were typically going under 20 miles an hour. And on a highway, you're going in excess of 60 miles an hour in certain scenarios.
Yeah, you mentioned tractor rollovers. I know there's a statistic that 1 in 10 farms are going to experience a tractor rollover at some point in their farming career. Are there any things we can do to, prevent that, or other things, that are common on farm?
Yeah, occurrences? For sure. You look at this time of the year, a lot of guys are moving to different fields with a smaller tractor with a bush hog cleaning up ditchways, right? So, making sure those roll cages, sometimes those roll cages are rolled down to get in tight areas under trees. So, taking that extra second when you get in, if you're just letting it warm up, make sure those roll cages are up, and, the seat belts that are there, sometimes you get on there and they're zip tied because, the safety alarms are buzzing and you need to get on and off, and, very much guilty of it, ourselves, right? But, they are there for a reason, especially when you're on any type of incline, being very cognizant of that is very important.
So one of the things that comes to mind, Luke, is I think of actually a specific farmer. I won't say their name. They actually did. I will call them out if they are watching. They did used to work with us at Climate, so hopefully that doesn't give them away. But I do remember getting the text from him and that his combine had caught on fire. And it was a pretty, he totally fine, totally safe, was able to get away from the fire. But I remember seeing that video, and I just, that happened all very quickly, right? He had a bunch of grain in the back, and it just kind of boom from there, right? You know, my question to you, especially as you think of your community, what are some tips or tricks there to combat against some of that heat, especially as you're running through corn? What comes to mind on how to basically protect yourself against that?
Maintenance is going to be the biggest thing. So you look at a combine or really any balers, you know, where I live, we have a lot of dairy. And so we have a lot of balers, and typically that's just a lot of moving parts that are, you know, working with bearings. And if you're not doing your maintenance, you know, not doing your daily inspection, dust builds up in corners, and, you know, you have birds overnight building nests. Really, bird nests are kind of one of the leading causes of fires. That extra couple seconds of just peeking under the hood, you know, like turbos is typically where they like to nest. There's like a nice little perfect area. You know, sometimes I think they put welcome signs from the factory for them.
Wow. Yeah. I didn't realize that was the spot.
Yeah, I will say on fires. So I always know I feel like I have a story for everything, but I do have a story.
You do.
So this farmer will remain nameless, but they're from my home area, and this leads into a question for you as a firefighter. But one of his tractors caught on fire, and out in the middle of nowhere on a county road that's just numbered. It's really hard to give directions to where the piece of equipment is. He ended up calling the fire department trying to give directions, and they were asking, "Well, do you have an address? Do you have a location you can give us?" And he said, "You go down this road, and it's the first tractor on fire on your left." But for you as a first responder, so if you're out in the middle of nowhere,
that's a good question.
How would you want people to direct you if there is some kind of an accident that's occurred?
Yep. Using common landmarks. So, you know, typically in a smaller community, if you say, "Hey, we're going to John Smith's farm," and it's the first giant oak tree on the right, most of us are going to know that, but the dispatcher you're going to get on the front isn't going to know what that means. So using common crossroads. So if you're off State Highway 185, for example, you know, hey, we're 2 miles east of 185. That's enough for us to be able to get enough information to get going that direction. Because, we can see a cloud of smoke and kind of get close to it. And then also, you know, understanding the culverts and the access points. That's really critical, especially you look at, you know, our water trucks we have for like in rural areas, we don't have fire hydrants in the middle of fields. So we have big folding tanks and, you know, 3,000 gallon tankers. Well, if there's a low area or a ditch that you can get over with a tractor, we may not be able to get over with a truck.
Sure.
So, you know, any access in the field is also very critical.
That's good. You bringing that up, that's a good thought.
Yeah. And it's a true story. No one was hurt in that instance, but I think a neighbor ended up leaving a sign next to the tractor after it burned down saying "runs a little hot."
Runs a little hot.
Yeah.
Fire sale, we call that.
Fire sale.
Fire sale.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I know, those happen every year. I know when I was a field rep for Climate, there was one year that I think there were 3 different combine fires that happened in Central Illinois that I knew of.
Yep.
So it's very common.
It's one of those things that is it's just common, and I think like your comment about maintenance, the bird nest thing still blows my mind a little bit. I just never would have thought something, you know, so small
and so fast
overnight, right? It's that's unreal. That's unreal.
Yeah.
You know, another thing, Luke, as we're talking about this too, and I think we've kind of throughout our conversation had some of these scattered and sprinkled into each one of our topics, but maybe just some common sense, quick hit safety tips. What comes to mind? You know, everything from start of the day to end of the day. What comes to mind to you, and what are those things just to think about that? Yes, life gets moving. We get moving quick. We only got a few good days to run. We want to make sure we're getting stuff done, and everyone does start moving quick. But again, maybe slow it down a little bit. What else on that list comes to mind for you?
Yeah, sleep and preparation. You know, that goes hand in hand for both the farming and the fire service side, right? You look at everything we do in both industries, right? There's a lot of prep, a lot of planning that goes on early. But whenever it's springtime and we got to get in the field and there's rain coming, or when it's a call 2 a.m, things change. There's a lot of things outside of our control. So being comfortable with that. And a lot of that is more on the mental side, right? So making sure that you're treating yourself well, your well-being, and, getting a good night rest. I mean, I'm very much guilty of it, of, working out in the field till 2 a.m. and getting back after at 6 a.m. And, that got the job done. But, if there's something that happens that you're not ready for and you're not in that state of mind, that is so critical.
In the event that something does go wrong and, you get injured out in the field, what would your advice be in that kind of a situation, Luke?
Having a communication schedule. So, we do have a bunch of resources of, Apple Watches, phones, but you look at a lot of the rural areas, you may not have service.
Sure.
Right?
Yep.
So, on our operation, we use handheld walkie-talkies. And so even if my guy's down the road working on something, we still kind of check in every now and then. And you kind of know, kind of using some of the technology that is available just to see if things are moving. Sometimes that's half the battle. You may not have to check in, take your eyes off of what you're doing, but just being able to, check in and have other people kind of keep an eye on things, and, even being able to swap out operators from time to time, and, even just taking the extra 20 minutes to stop and eat. And, that's a huge thing too.
That's right.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point. Having a communication plan is something that I wouldn't have thought of. You have to have your plan about what field am I going to go to next. But if you have, 5, 6, 10 people out there operating, you want to make sure that, man, I haven't heard from Luke in an hour. I should probably go check on him.
Yep.
And we're so dependent on our mobile devices, and the cell coverage has gotten so good, but there are still those low spots or those specific fields that they don't have that coverage. And the walkie-talkie, whatever it is, the CB radio. But I do agree, something maybe in your pocket is really crucial, I would say.
Yep.
Having a communication plan is 100% key. And I know one of the things that a lot of people don't enjoy doing, but is necessary, is, cleaning out grain bins, getting into a grain bin. I'm sure that's on the top of a lot of people's mind whenever they clicked on this to learn about on-farm safety.
You bet.
But, what are the pieces of advice that you'd give there?
Yep. So when it comes to grain bin safety, making sure that you look at a lot of the older bins, you look on our operation, right? We have a bunch of straight stick ladders. So, making sure if it's early in the morning, you're checking that moisture, make sure that things are dry, especially dewy mornings, early mornings, it's very easy to slip. And, when you're 20 feet up, your back's not going to appreciate that, right? So, and then also too, you look at the logistics of moving grain. There's a lot of augers involved. There's a lot of safety guards in place. But whenever you have something stuck, if you're in that high moisture corn, or, you got your soybeans that you left overnight and it got real dewy, you left the tarp off, right? it happens. Try not to use your foot to dislodge some of those things, and, making sure that you have your balance. And if you're working in high places, make sure you're kind of tied off to a safety harness or things like that.
I think we've all, and maybe it's just maybe it's just me, but I think it's all of us at Bear, at least. We've all seen the safety videos. But if you do catch yourself falling into a bin, what do you do? What's your next step?
Stay still. It's very similar to quicksand. So the more that you're moving, the more that the kernels and, the soybeans, whatever you're in, is going to compress, and you're going to move yourself down. You're heavier than the grain. And so the best thing you can do is to have some form of communication that's easily accessible to you. So if you have something like an Apple Watch, and you can say, "Hey Siri, can you call for help?"
Walkie-talkies, hopefully.
Yep. Some form of that you can quickly get help, because it's not so much that you're gonna drown in the grain, but you look at the area with all the dust and some of that. If you don't get help there quickly, then your chances of survival is dwindling every minute.
So stay still, communication plan, back to that. Maybe even having a buddy system, so someone knows where you are, right? Communication sounds like a key factor, honestly, in our whole conversation today.
Yep, and as weird as it may sound, this is something that we started doing a couple of years ago. Is just every time we enter a bin, we send a text. If we don't hear after X number, just check. It's as simple as that, right?
It's just like going on a flight. I text whenever the flight leaves, and I text when the flight lands. Text when you go in, text when you come out.
Yep.
And it sounds like there's 3 buckets, at least as I'm picking up. It's communication, having, a clear plan with your team, but then also there's the mental awareness and that piece as well. I don't know if we have
I think we should dive into that a little bit.
Yeah.
I think that's extremely important, that mental health piece, but it's something we don't always think about nor talk about. So what, from your perspective and your lens, maybe let's unpack that.
Yeah, you look at mental health both in farming and in the fire service, right? On both ends, you're dealing with things that are out of your control, things that, we all naturally want to control, and we want things to go the way that we planned. But ultimately, it's dealing with that. And so, going into whether it's harvest season or going into a burning building, right? Like, that you've worked and trained up for this moment, but it ultimately comes back to like that muscle memory that when things don't go as planned,
sure,
that you're kind of ready. And when things don't go the way that you think it is or the way that you've planned, you need to be able to have a support system. So, like having family and friends and, taking the extra time to appreciate, kind of what you have, especially in farming, right? Like we see that, we always want to hit high yields and, the mental health of while you're harvesting, you can always think that, hey, somebody's probably got it worse, right? And so like having some of those wins, or if you get through a field with no problems, right? Like celebrate some of those. There's a lot to the mental health piece, and then sharing some of that, naturally in both industries. We don't like to talk about failures or how things went, but it's, it's super important to, keep that conversation going. Don't try to take all the burden on everything yourself, because in either industry you'll overwork yourself, and ultimately, like mental health is the number one reason of suicide and things like that in both professions.
And at the end of the day, the most important thing is getting home.
Yep.
Getting home and making sure you do it safely.
Yeah, we all have families, we all have pets, that we want to get home to. They want us to get home to and enjoy the rest of the time that we have.
Yeah, that's a big thing I think about, that, rural communities, whether it's thinking about being a firefighter or the farm, a lot of it's about legacy. And, you can have a great year, you can have a bad year. I know in some areas
that's right.
It seems to go every other year. But at the end of the day, it's all about continuing that legacy and having that, connection with the people and your network that are most important to you. For sure.
100%.
Luke, what would you say to a viewer who maybe has thought about becoming a volunteer firefighter, but necessarily hasn't pulled the trigger yet on doing so? What would your advice or guidance be to that person? And, how did you, at the end, again, I know we talked about it a bit, but how did you know, like, eventually this is what I want to do?
Yeah, I always kind of had a preconceived notion that firefighters are all paid and it's a career choice, right? Like I'm going to have to give up everything I do and focus on that. And, like we were talking earlier, most of our departments in the U.S. are volunteer. So, going to a meeting or somebody, if that's on the department, reaching out and just say it's something of interest, there's a whole lot of expectations for volunteer organizations, right? You have guys that are fully committed, that are, putting a lot of time and effort into it. But as volunteer organizations, it's as much time as you can put into it, right?
Yep.
So while there is a lot of training and preparation that is required to do the basic functions that continue, there's still that aspect of, hey, we understand that you work a full-time job, you're not going to be fully committed, but, just kind of understanding locally, reaching out. And, like I said, I never thought I would ever do it. And, it's been a great experience.
That's awesome.
I mean, I know several times I've seen you come on camera onto a team meeting or a call, and you've still got your fire gear on, just coming back from a call. I've been pleasantly surprised with the amount of people that we work with that, they don't talk about it all the time, but I can think of 3 right off the top of my head who are also first responders that I work with. But I think that really speaks back to the ag industry as a whole and the commitment to rural communities.
Yeah, you look at both industries, we don't really flaunt what we do. We don't really take a whole lot of credit, but at the end of the day, it is that attitude of, hey, we need to go in and get things done. We know there's a job to be done, and we get it done with what resources we have, and we accomplish things at the end of the day on both sides of the fence. So, I think, like you said, it really shows the true values of what it means to be in agriculture or the fire service.
You bet. So I think that's a good opportunity to give a shout out to all the first responders. We really appreciate everything you do. And especially, even with my time with Bear, Luke, similar to you, I didn't realize a lot of folks were volunteers, and just big thank you to everyone and our first responders, especially those who volunteer and take the time out of their day to do so. In episode 47, Luke, we did touch on mental health a little bit, and one of the pieces there was indicators. And being a community and caring about everyone in the community. Can you maybe touch on some of those indicators to be aware of, especially from a community perspective?
Yeah, I think when you look at the average age of a farmer, that has progressively gone up, right?
Sure, yeah.
And so we all know, unfortunately, as age goes up, you're losing friends and family along the way. So, if you notice that, hey, maybe Farmer Joe hasn't been to church in a couple of weeks, or, we haven't seen him as active as he was, and maybe he's slow to progress with harvest, just, checking in, spend some time, some of those are just, you look at, maybe what they're going through, maybe their machines aren't as prepared as they once were, can't move around as much. Typically speaking, I would say most communities are pretty good at, reaching out and helping out in those times of need. But, always kind of taking that extra look around and, keep an eye on those things.
Yeah. It's all about preparedness and communication. We've talked about that a lot, but not just communication within your own farming network and your operation, but also with your neighbors and your friends.
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely. No, I appreciate you touching on those. I think that's really, really important.
Yeah.
As we think of the mental health piece.
Yeah. And I guess, another thing that is obviously top of mind for a lot of people is, farming. And it sounds like, the fire service is heavily regulated. So what's top of mind for you as we go through harvest season and the rest of the year?
Yeah. So when you look at regulation, both whether that's in the fire service or in agriculture, there's certain things that we have to operate within. And you look at the rising cost to farm, it's the same with the fire service, right? So you look at the cost just to have a truck stocked. I talked a little bit earlier on the cost of technology. So, just how we have on the operation upgrading our old machines to new trucks, new gear. Yep. There's a hefty price tag, right, that comes with that. So there's a lot of regulations that require that a lot of our fire suits, a lot of our breathing apparatuses, our truck apparatuses, they can only have a certain lifespan to be within regulation. And so once you get outside of that regulation, you can lose your ability that if there were to be some type of claim that you would be, not able to progress or, get paid out if there was a lawsuit or something that occurred from that, that authenticity of time.
Sure. What does a fire truck cost? And this we talked about this a little bit. I'm kind of taking this one from Andy.
That's fine. It's fine. You can live on my laurels. But
it's a good question. It really is.
But we talked about equipment, farm equipment. It's expensive.
It is expensive.
Protecting the community has to be expensive as well. What does a tanker truck or your first responder vehicles cost?
Yep. So we recently went through the purchase of a truck that we ordered 2 years ago, and it'll take a couple years to get in. So it's not like a Chevy dealership where you can just go select a truck. There's a lot of fire trucks are specialty built for every department. Every department has different needs. So there's a lot of customization and a lot of like hands-on building.
Yeah.
So as a small, village of 800, we were hitting that point of $1 million for one new truck. And our previous one that was 23 years old originally cost us $100,000. So you've seen almost a increase, almost a 10x over 25 years, just for a cost of a truck. And a lot of that is, with advance of technology, but it's always kind of, no different than what an 8400 costs compared to a new 8RX, right? Like it's, very much progressed in both areas.
And in your situation, was that community driven to help even fund the new truck?
Yeah. So our tax base, we're very fortunate that we were able to increase our tax revenue. So we don't have a whole lot of growth in our rural community, but we have incremental tax increases that we put in through our local communities. So there's a lot of local support. And we, companies like Bayer have donated a lot of money over time to a lot of our departments, and we rely a lot on grants. So there's a lot of, federal grants and private grants that we write for that help with a lot of, just even things like our fire suits, right? Like, we have to keep those replaced every 10 years. And, a cost for just one suit could be upwards of $5,000 per person.
Man.
And you're talking a volunteer organization that's relying on a tax base to go through, 30 suits every 10 years.
Wow.
Yeah.
You can start doing the math; it can add up real quick.
So what can people do to help support, people that are first responders? Because we talk about in the ag industry, technology and equipment, and it's vital to being productive and being safe. So what can people do, to help support?
A lot of volunteer organizations will do fundraising efforts. So a lot of our just like normal maintenance and things that we do, we have a couple fundraisers every year. So just simply going out and supporting those events. A lot of them are simple things like barbecues or charity golf type things. Just being an active person in your community. Making sure that your tax bill's paid because that's where a lot of that comes from.
It's important on a lot of fronts. Yeah.
So. And then you look at from the agriculture side, right? You have resources like the Farm Bureau, and you have extension offices through state universities, advocating both for agriculture and the needs of simple things like access to water. Those are community development grants for smaller communities, and being involved even like on your community board to impact things like water availability or impact things like internet access to rural areas, always kind of being that voice for the larger, groups to, allocate funding accordingly.
So, thinking about you all not just being employees like we have in farming operations and us at Bayer, but as being volunteers, what kind of protections are you all given, or what kind of resources and support do you all get as volunteers?
Yeah, so we are required by law to report things through, companies like OSHA, and we have federal compliance to show that if we have 100 calls a year that we have well documented and keep record of those. But we have a lot of different administrative things that our board has to work through. So things like life insurance policies, things just like workers' comp claims, like if you fall off a truck and break your foot, or you fall on ice, or if you get we have to be protected while we try to work to do other things, right? And so if you're hurt on the job, a lot of departments are required to have some level of like workers' comp or some type of insurance that kind of gets paid, and that's a cost to the department or the district that is kind of assumed there. But again, you look at the rising cost of a lot of those things, what it takes to fund a truck and a group of individuals that are working for free, right? That will continue to increase with a lot of those things.
So as we wrap up here, Andy, and I'm asking for your help on this one too, because we've talked about a lot of great topics today, Luke. I mean, a lot of important topics, but really want to just kind of bullet out a few things as takeaways, more or less, as we wrap up today. So the first one is planning and being prepared. What would you add to that?
I would say it covers a couple things. A harvest plan, having a harvest plan ready, so you know where the staff is going to be, when to dispatch people know where other people are going to be, but also preparedness, getting your equipment ready, making sure that there aren't bird nests in there that are going to catch fire, and making sure that you have all of your safety precautions set up and ready. The
bird nest to me still I don't know why that's not something I've thought about before, but that one is wild. And the second one that I had written down is communication. Yeah. And I think that was a big one. We almost could put communication across everything we talked about today. But Andy, what do you think? What do you take away from just the communication piece?
I think communication was the big through line that can help maybe not fend off a lot of things that are going to happen, but it can at least help alleviate and make, the response that people like Luke are going to be able to get out there to a lot quicker. And I think that's where technology, and Luke, you talked about a lot of those, technology plays a big piece in making better connection between the people that are out there in the field.
Yep. And then that third one was mental health, identifying indicators, partnering with others to check on people more or less, keep that conversation going. But what was your takeaway?
Yeah, just making sure that the community is rallying around each other and everybody's, taking care of each other. We're all in the farming industry. Things change, things happen, things are going to go wrong. And that's when people that are in the fire service and other first responders are going to come out there and, do what they can to help alleviate the situation. But we talked about community. It still comes back to also supporting those first responders.
Right. That is the most, everything's important, but that piece right there almost is a foundation for all communities that are out there. I mean, you started off telling us about new equipment for the community, 23 years old, right? I want to make sure I got my number right there. 23 years old for your fire truck and getting a new one, and the cost that put on the community, but coming together to ensure you have the right equipment to be successful. I think that really is the glue.
Yeah, 100%. Making sure that, just like in farming, that the people that need to do the job have the tools they need and the resources.
Well, hey, we just, again, want to make sure we say thank you to our first responders out there, and a big thank you to all those folks. And, this has been Around the Farm podcast about all things ag and safety today.
And safety
today. Sponsored by Climate FieldView. And if it's your first time listening, be sure to hit that subscribe button or listen to us anywhere where you get podcasts. And we'll see you next time around the farm.